Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I'm joined this week for the Libertarian Angle by Jim Bovard, who's been writing for the Future of Freedom Foundation, I don't know, some 20-something years. And it's great to have you, Jim, as a co-host, and welcome to the Libertarian Angle.
Hey, Jacob, thanks for having me on. It's fun to raise a ruckus with you online.
Okay, the one thing, Jim, that you got to keep in mind, though, is that we try to have a lot of reverence for the federal government and the welfare warfare state here. And so, I know you sometimes have a difficult time in that area. So would you kind of try to keep it on a high road here?
Well, if reverence is what you're looking for, I don't know why you had me on your program.
Well, I just got back from Florida on a fantastic college tour where I was in 80-degree weather. It was fantastic leaving this weather here in Virginia.
That's the important thing, right?
Absolutely. And I had a rent car, was going from college campus to college campus. The gigs were in the evening and fantastic audiences. And, I thought they'd be about an hour long. We blocked out 2-hour block of time, but I spoke for about 40 minutes and then figured, about 20 minutes Q&A. Well, most of the sessions went the whole 2 hours and even beyond, and they were just fantastic sessions. And the theme of the talks was the welfare warfare state, or specifically how libertarianism is the hope for America. And so I talked generally about the welfare state and all the crises that we live under with the welfare state, and then, of course, the warfare state. So I thought, since I was having you on the show today, and since you've written so much on different aspects of the welfare state, including the drug war and the paternalistic state and healthcare and Social Security and USDA and farm subsidies and so forth, and then, of course, on foreign policy, all the stuff that's going on in foreign policy, I thought, it'd be useful for you and me to have a conversation about the various aspects of this way of life that we're living under. So I thought maybe we'd start with the welfare state. Give me your overall perspective of this kind of life that we're living under. Really, I call it a life of serfdom. I was telling the kids down there that Hayek wrote this book, The Road to Serfdom, but that was back in 1944, I think. I mean, we're there. We're living lives as serfs as far as I'm concerned, and this is our plight. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly gotten a lot worse since Hayek wrote his wonderful book, Road to Serfdom, which I recommend to everybody. It's amazing how docile so many people have become. It's amazing to see that things are no longer controversial. If you look at the asset forfeiture laws, you have the U.S. government and their partners in state and local enforcement out there confiscating property from tens of thousands of Americans who were never convicted of crimes. And Congress paid almost no attention, and the Justice Department thought it was great because they got all these windfalls, and it took the front page exposés by the Washington Post and New York Times, and some great work by groups like Institute for Justice and other activist groups to finally put these things on the radar screen again. It's funny to see the Attorney General Eric Holder saying, I'm shocked to see this going on, and of course we're going to make some reforms. Well, this is the same BS we've heard from the Justice Department going back to 1993 when there were it was over 20 years ago that the first controversies on assets forfeiture broke into the headlines, and the feds have promised to fix the mess time and again. But it doesn't make any sense to trust the Justice Department to end a program by which they've been able to enrich themselves and in which they enjoy so much power. This is something that Congress needs to slash the power of the feds. And it's great that a lot of states are moving against this to limit the power of the police and prosecutors to seize property from people who have never been convicted of a crime.
Yeah, and I mean, especially in the drug war. I mean, that to me is where I know it's not limited to the drug war, but I think that's where much of the abuse is taking place. And it's part of this paternalistic state where the government's going to take care of people by punishing those that ingest the wrong substances. If you drink alcohol or if you smoke tobacco or chew tobacco or whatever, that the government officials think that's okay, but on the illicit drugs, we're going to have to ruin your life and steal your money and put you away in jail for 20 or 30 years. And yeah, that's going to really cure the problem, which of course it hasn't over 40 or 50 years. But, I'm kind of glad you raised this asset forfeiture thing, because I've said from the very beginning, when I started FFF 25 years ago, I said, this drug war is about money and power. And that's all it's about. You can say, oh, well, they have good intentions. They're trying to eliminate drug use from society. Come on. We know that's not going to work. It hasn't ever worked. There's more drug use than ever before. So why do they continue with this war? And it's money and power. And, of course, there's the power over human beings, especially among racist cops, for example. This gives them a chance to harass blacks, stop blacks walking down the street, or while they're driving their car on the suspicion that they might have drugs. But now you've got the money involved with it. This is a big racket where, as you know, you've written on this, the cops are stopping poor people on the highway. People are dealing cash, like they're going to buy a used car or something. The cops find $10,000 and just seize it. And they're able to do it legally. It's your classic case of highway robbery.
And it's interesting to see the type of legal shenanigans that the feds have relied on for decades to use this. I think it was a Florida paper back in the late 1980s, back when Janet Reno was prosecutor, maybe in Miami or someplace down there like that, and she was cracking down on drugs. And one of the things they were doing to seize them was to take the money and then hold up to a drug dog and see if the drug dog gave a positive alert, because if the dog's tail wagged or whatever, the government would say, well, this proves that the money is tainted by drugs, and therefore this person, we have probable cause this person is a drug dealer, so therefore we're seizing the money. Well, there was a newspaper there that was interviewing Janet Reno on this, and before she became Attorney General, and asked to see the money in her purse or whatever, and held it up to the dog and got a positive alert. And Janet Reno, I forgot what she said, but she probably grumped. She's a big woman. But it was obvious 25 years ago that this drug dog alert thing was complete BS, because most of the U.S. currency is tainted with small amounts of drugs. Micro amounts, enough to set off a dog alert. And in other cases, police have trained the dogs to show some type of positive alert even when there wasn't any drugs. But this is a pretext that the police have used with federal encouragement for decades to confiscate cash from travelers. And even though it's obviously BS, it's like straight out of Monty Python with the test to see if the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There was a test to see if a woman was actually a witch, and what they would do is put her on the scales and see if the woman weighed more than a duck. And if the woman weighed more than a duck, that meant she was a witch and it was okay to burn her. And this is the moral and intellectual caliber of these cash seizures based on drug dog alerts. And almost everybody who's looked at this recognizes it as complete BS, but because it profits the government, it's been continued. There's an absolute lack of shame on these prosecutors and federal policymakers.
Well, and the state and local police forces, too. What I find fascinating is that the money goes directly into the police coffers rather than into the general revenue for the county or the city. And so they have this incentive to go out and seize as much cash as they are, because then they become self-funding fiefdoms. They don't have to answer to the elected officials in the city council or the county court or whatever. They just go out and fund their own department by stealing money from people. And then, of course, they say, well, if you don't like it, sue us. But who can sue when they've had their cash taken from them and seized by the government? Lawyers are going to probably charge as much as the amounts of cash that are being seized. So it's just a great big racket.
Yeah, and a lawyer for asset recovery is usually $5,000 or more, and whether you succeed or not is up in the air. And often, if they're seizing an old car or something less than $5,000, the police know that. and it's all rigged. As far as the money going to the state and local law enforcement, there was a provision in the federal system called equitable sharing, in which there are many states which did not allow the police to directly confiscate people's property and put it in their budgets. But there was a workaround. What the feds would do would be to there'd be a lateral of the seized property to the feds, and then the feds would give most of it back to the state and local law enforcement, but it had to go directly to the law enforcement agencies. So this is a provision which basically subverted local control of the police, but it worked out well for the Justice Department because they got all this cooperation, and they got lots of photo opportunities, and congressmen enjoyed posing for some of the photos as well.
Yeah, well, I think these people that are trying to get these things, asset forfeitures, abolished, are really doing a good job. But let's face it, the real root of the problem is the drug war. And I said a long time ago that when this whole welfare state starts to go, and I think it's going to go, I think people are figuring out that this is leading this country into financial and monetary bankruptcy, the whole welfare warfare state is. But I said a long time ago, the first program I think is going to go of the welfare state is the drug war. And I think you see the progress we've made. I mean, 25 years ago, I could light up the phone calls on a talk show by calling for drug legalization. You can't do that anymore. I mean, the issue is on the table, and you got a lot of respectable people, federal judges, police officers, federal officials that are all calling for an end to this war on drugs, and it can't come too soon. And the nice thing about that is you pull the weed out by its root, and so you get rid of asset forfeiture and all the drug gangs and cartels and all the other collateral damage that comes with this horrendous war.
Well, it's a step in the right direction. I think I published my first piece in the drug war in 1983, an op-ed in the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner in favor of making marijuana legal. And I still recall when I was living in Washington, D.C. at that point, and there was a photocopy shop that I used to make copies of my articles, and I went down there to get copies of that article, and I didn't have self-service copiers, and there was some old guy working behind the desk. And he got furious by my article. I can't believe you write this kind of stuff. What kind of person are you? I said, I'm a journalist. But it's good the drug war is winding down. I mean, the flip side is it's amazing this crap went on for so long that the government was able to demonize so many people that for year after year, 800,000 people were being arrested for marijuana, which is like chicken feed as far as it just makes no sense. It's amazing to see how much damage politicians could do for so long based on this drug pretext. And we don't know what kind of BS that they're going to pull out of their hats next. I mean, is there going to be some new definition of terrorism, some new definition of terrorist supporter? It might be that the feds are going to say that folks who visit suspicious websites are going to lose this or that right. And if that's the case, it's going to be bad news for Future Freedom Foundation.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that they always are looking for places to expand their power. And, you mentioned about writing, Jim, and you have been one of the most successful libertarians I know in terms of writing op-eds and publishing books on various aspects of libertarianism. Your book, Lost Rights, is just a classic in the movement. It's like a gold standard. Why don't you share? I'm sure there's young libertarians out there that would love to get into writing and publishing op-eds. And since you've been so successful, you've gotten published in the Wall Street Journal, Playboy Magazine, Washington Times, any number of others that maybe you can mention. And why don't you talk a little bit about how you got into writing and how you achieved this really market level of success?
Well, it goes back a few decades. I was given a choice by a judge. I either had to join the Marines or become a writer. And so, it's a question of going to jail, joining the Marines, or becoming a writer. So I said, well, I guess I'll become a writer. No, I mean, I hadn't really planned on becoming a writer until I turned about 18. And then I decided, I suddenly became hell-bent on the idea. And dropped out of college, and then to pursue a writing career, because I figured having a bachelor's degree wouldn't help much for becoming a writer. So, and eventually the articles started to sell, so I kept writing. It's interesting. There have been different periods where editors are more open to libertarian, submissions. I don't know that right now is a boom time for that. I mean, there's a certain, there are certain issues like gay marriage and the drug war that libertarian positions have become fashionable. But as far as having any doubts about whether, as far as openly questioning whether the government has a right to keep seizing most of your, seizing the lion's share of your income and raising questions about whether people are obliged to submit to whatever Congress decrees, these are ideas that are probably still far beyond the pale as far as the mainstream publications. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, so there are some ideas that papers are open to, and it's kind of seasonal, or it's it's interesting. There was a lot more enthusiasm for libertarian type notions before 9/11 than there was after 9/11, because there was such a backlash after 9/11 in favor of blind trust in the government. The poll showed that the percentage of Americans who trusted the government to do the right thing doubled in the 2 weeks after 9/11. And President Bush certainly exploited this to seize all kinds of new powers from which we're still suffering, as far as the National Security Agency vacuuming up our email, as far as the president effectively being able to suspend habeas corpus for people he labels as dangerous threats, as far as the president's ability to kill people on his own decree based on whatever he says or doesn't say.
Yeah, it really is incredible that we, and I was telling these kids this on these students down in my tour, is that a lot of Americans don't realize that we now live under a government post 9/11 that wields the legal authority to round up any Americans and put them in a military dungeon or a concentration camp, no due process of law, no trial, torture them. That's what the Jose Padilla case was about. Detain them indefinitely. Or just assassinate them. That's what the Anwar al-Awlaki situation was about, is that the government claims the authority to assassinate any American, of course, anybody else as well. But that's an extraordinary thing. And I agree with you. There was this deference to authority that where people just said, we got to trust the government. The government knows best. We saw this in the invasion of Iraq when they brought up the whole WMD scam. That people just said, oh, we got to trust the government. We got to trust the government. And what's interesting about this, Jim, is that when foreign countries do this, totalitarian regimes seize on emergencies and crises, like in Venezuela right now, this is what Maduro's doing. Maduro's hyping up the fact that Obama just declared Venezuela a threat to national security, and he says this means we may get invaded at any time. And, of course, there's some kind of rationality to that thinking, because the U.S. government does do those sort of things. But notice what Maduro's doing. He's seizing on this crisis and hyping it up, and now he's gone to the legislature asking for emergency extraordinary powers. Well, the mainstream journalists here can see that, and they mock it and they ridicule it. But when the U.S. president does the exact same thing post 9/11, everybody just bows in reverence to the whole national security state.
Well, I mean, it's a paradox, because from how you described it, it sounds as if the Venezuelan leader had to ask his legislature for those extraordinary powers, unlike a lot of what George W. did. You'd mentioned torture a minute ago, and it's interesting. Torture is one of the examples of how America has so radically changed in the last 15 years, because there were lots of issues I was writing about in the 1990s, and I was writing in favor of getting rid of the postal monopoly and writing about the abuses of, government schools, writing about property rights, asset forfeiture, drugs. But all of a sudden, after 9/11, after 2004, I find myself ending up writing about torture. And, it's sad to see that America has reached a point that it's necessary to argue and try to persuade people that, no, torture is a bad thing. No, we shouldn't be torturing people. And I was fascinated by the poll results in December after the Senate committee report on the CIA torture came out, that a majority of Americans, according to at least the main poll that I saw, majority of Americans said that it was wrong to make that report public, that it should have been kept secret, or that perhaps the Senate never should have investigated it. So not only are most people apparently okay with torture at this point, but they're also in favor of keeping the torture secrecy. And it's this is a new definition of self-government. And okay, if the government can torture people and then cover it up, it's like, okay, so how exactly is this a republic? How is this the rule of law? Well, it's rule of law except for the torture and the surveillance and the asset forfeiture and about 37 other things.
Yeah, I mean, this really is the omnipotent state. I mean, this was the big revolution in the 40s with the national security state. And now, since we've all been born and raised under this type of way of life, hardly anyone questions it. It's only really the libertarians that are questioning it. And
actually, as far as the torture, a lot of the best work has been done by liberals, American Civil Liberties Union, the folks. There's a number of folks who've done great lawsuits on these things. But FFF was always out in front on the torture issue, unlike one or two large libertarian organizations which were rather quiet on it. So that's all to FFF's credit.
Yeah, I mean, to us, it's always been a moral issue that when you live in a society that purports to stand for freedom and moral principles, you don't do things just because somebody else is doing them. And what I mean about questioning the national security state, this again goes to the root of things, is that we can fight these important battles along the way, like torture and assassination and stuff. But my argument is that as long as you have this strange apparatus, this alien apparatus attached onto our federal governmental system called the national security state that came into existence in the 40s, that Eisenhower himself in his farewell address acknowledged that this was alien to the American way of life, that this is not what the founding fathers intended. This is not what the framers intended to bring into existence. As long as you have this giant apparatus, the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon, the giant military establishment, all this empire of bases, domestic and foreign, you're going to have this type of stuff. I mean, it's like thunder comes after lightning, and the torture and the assassinations and the indefinite detention, the spying, the surveillance, it comes with this totalitarian-like apparatus. And it seems to me that it's only the libertarians who are questioning that apparatus itself. Maybe a few liberals, but I don't think there's very many of them questioning the apparatus itself.
Well, it certainly seems like there's fewer liberals questioning it than there were before January 20th, 2009. There was a lot of vigorous liberal opposition to Bush's Iraq war. I've went to quite a few of the demonstrations in Washington D.C. and there were some great turnouts. But after Obama became president, that pretty much fizzled out. I was at I think it was like around August 31st, 2013. I happened to be downtown and knocking around, and I heard there was going to be an anti-war rally on Syria outside the White House. And so I went there, had my camera, got some nice shots. And there were a couple of handfuls of demonstrations, including some conservative, paleo-conservative, libertarian types, probably a couple dozen or two of those. But it was okay demonstration. And then all of a sudden, this busload of people came up from what's the name? Answer.com. There was an Answer.com group. I think it's Answer.com. But coming in out of Baltimore, and they had great signs, and they were marching, and they were chanting, and President Obama was actually people were expecting Obama would announce in the Saturday speech to the president that day that the bombs were on the way in Syria, but partly because of the public backlash against that, President Obama did not launch the bombs at that time. But it was funny because the chants from the anti-war demonstrators could be heard in the background in his presidential speech, his presidential radio commentary. And the folks from the leftists were active enough that the park police came riding in on horses to bust up the demonstration. So that was, it's always nice to see free speech in action.
Oh yeah, but I mean, what a disappointment he's been. I mean, I myself thought that he was going to be a little bit stronger on civil liberties. I thought sure he'd close Guantanamo Bay, but nothing. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he's just the continuation of the George W. Bush administration. And look at the message. It's so amazing to me, Jim, that people continue to defer to the national security state and to the president and so forth. And they keep thinking, well, if we just get the right president in office, that's going to solve the problem. I mean, look at the messes. I don't know if you caught General Petraeus's op-ed I think it was in the Post over the weekend, but I mean, it was just a piece of hilarity where he's given all these excuses as to why Iraq is such a disaster. And now you've got this big crisis in Yemen. You've got in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, ISIS. Why do people continue to put their faith in this whole apparatus and this whole paradigm of the warfare state when things have obviously turned out so bad, much worse than even the drug war?
Yeah, there's all these different faith building exercises that politicians do. It's just getting people in the habit of standing all the time and saying the Pledge of Allegiance and singing the Star Spangled Banner and supporting events and all that stuff. But to take a step back on Obama, yeah, he's been a huge disappointment on foreign policy and on civil liberties. I always assumed that his economic policy would be a disaster, and he's not disappointed me on that. But I thought that at least on some of the margins on civil liberties, he would be better. But one thing on foreign policy, at least he hasn't dragged the nation into war against Iran. And it's appalling to see so many members of the GOP, the 47 senators that signed that letter and others that just seem to be kind of chopping at the bit to send the U.S. Army off on another war, even though we don't really have an extra army to throw into the Persian Gulf. And even though the most recent wars have worked out disastrously, it's frustrating that we don't know the facts behind what's been driving the U.S. government policy for many years. But as far as some of the flip-flops in Obama's foreign policy, because it seemed like at some point in late 2013 that at least some of his top people realized that the U.S. would be idiotic to get involved in Syria. And yet there were a couple of videos of beheadings that came out. Then all of a sudden the U.S. starts bombing, which was, I think, a huge mistake. But at least he hasn't dragged the nation into war against Iran. But the flip side is that was the same thing that Franklin Roosevelt was boasting in 1940 in his re-election campaign for his third term. Is like, hey, we kept us out of war. And then as soon as he got elected, it's like, okay, how can we get us into the war? So. Yeah,
I have to wonder, too, where the real power is. We tend to think that the real power in this country is with the president. But this great book I've finished reading, which I highly recommend everybody to get, is National Security and Double Government, where the author, a guy named Glennon, who I think teaches at Tufts University, talks about the double state, that it's the national security state apparatus where all the power is, and they just make it look to the American people like the president and the Congress and the judiciary still wield the same kind of power under what he called the Madisonian structure. But it's the Trumanite structure, the national security apparatus, that really has all the power, not only because of information gathering, which he emphasizes, but I would add to that, they got all the guns and the tanks and the military. And so I don't think we can ever discount the influence that they have in terms of telling the president, the Congress, and so forth how things are going to go. In the little time we have left, Jim, I want to just commend you on a position you took many years ago that maybe you could talk a little bit about, and that's Waco and Ruby Ridge. I mean, because the mindset and the environment was pretty much the same as it was after 9/11. People, I remember libertarians were saying, "Oh, you got to be careful. Don't go after the government too much. They can really do bad things to you." And you were fearless. I mean, you stood up against that massacre at Waco, and you stood up against what they did at Ruby Ridge. And why don't you share some of the sentiments that you were experiencing at that time?
Some of the hostility I was experiencing.
Yeah.
It was my hope that Waco would have been the most important public education lesson of the 1990s. It didn't work out that way. Just after the FBI went in there with the tanks with the fire and ended up with a fire that killed 80 people, the public approval ratings for the government were, I think, 90%. And what the Washington Press Corps did was rush to make Janet Reno a hero, put a halo over her head, which was utterly bizarre. But it was fun to push on those hot button issues because I felt those were some of the issues that could most clearly explain how much power the government had. And it was a hoot when the FBI director, Louis Freeh, wrote letters to the Wall Street Journal and Washington Times making attacks on articles I'd done on Ruby Ridge. He and I were going back and forth on that. Then about 6 months later, the Justice Department effectively pled guilty and paid a $3 million settlement to the Weaver family after the killing by the FBI of Vicki Weaver and the killing of their son by U.S. Marshals. So but there was a lot of trepidation by a lot of folks about even raising those issues, partly because the government had demonized the victims, as usually happens. So, but it's, that was something else which you were very strong on, which I appreciate. I was looking at some of my old speech tapes, and there were speeches I gave in 1995 for FFF where I talked about Waco and Ruby Ridge, and you didn't shush me.
No, those were dark days, I remember, and we took a firm stance, and we were really proud to be publishing your stuff because you were really leading out with this with the principal position. And the upside of this is that it seems to me that it was the libertarians that shifted the mindset in America, and where people started having a sense of conscience and realizing that the government was wrong here, that people shouldn't have been deferring to it. And the legacy of this is that they've never done it again. And that's a result of having stood firmly in favor of moral principles, because when they've had opportunities to do it, that couple up in the Northeast somewhere that were engaged in tax resistance, they didn't go and massacre them. And there's been 2 or 3 other standoffs where the feds have just sort of backed off and handled things diplomatically and getting it resolved peacefully. And if it hadn't been, in my opinion, for people like you and, well, those of us that were taking the lead against that, we'd have had a lot more massacres. And so it kind of gives us an idea of the power of ideas, the power of principles, and that if we can do things that in a constructive way on that episode, we can do the same thing with respect to the welfare state and the warfare state. Anyway, that's the end of the show. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
No. I was going to say, I hope you're right.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. Greatly enjoyed the visit. And this has been the Libertarian Angle, and we'll see you next week.